They say blood is thicker than water, but I learned the hard way that it's also much easier to spill. I was fighting for my life in a sterile hospital room when the people who gave me life simply walked away. They thought they left me with nothing. They didn't realize they left me with the one thing I needed to destroy their world: the truth. My name is Lily Rose. For 24 years, I lived a life that looked like a postcard. I had the perfect suburban upbringing, the parents who never missed a recital, and a future that felt like a straight, paved road. But life has a way of throwing a glass bottle at your windshield just when you're starting to enjoy the view. It started with a bruise, just a small, purple smudge on my shin that wouldn't go away. Then came the fatigue, the kind of exhaustion that feels like your bones are made of lead. When the doctor finally sat me down, the air in the room felt like it had been sucked out through a straw. Leukemia. It's funny how one word can turn your entire identity into a medical chart. I remember looking at my mother's face. She didn't cry. She didn't reach out to hold my hand. She just checked her watch. My father looked at the floor, his jaw tight, as if my diagnosis was a personal insult to his weekend plans. The first few weeks were a blur of antiseptic smells and the constant hum of machines. I waited for them to show up. I waited for the "we'll get through this" speeches, but the chairs in my room stayed empty. The flowers they sent were store-bought and lacked a card. Then the insurance calls started. The experimental treatments were expensive. My father, a man who obsessed over his stock portfolio more than his daughter's heartbeat, made a decision. It wasn't a decision made in heat or anger. It was calculated. I woke up one Tuesday morning to find a letter on my bedside table. No hug, no goodbye, just a legal-sized envelope. They were distancing themselves. They claimed the emotional and financial burden was compromising the family's stability. They didn't just leave the hospital. They moved. They left a 24-year-old girl to die alone because I was no longer a good investment. Quick break here. I'd love to know where and at what time you're listening to this story. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I read every single one. For months, I fought. I fought through the nausea, the hair loss, and the soul-crushing silence of a room that only saw nurses. I became a ghost in my own body. But ghosts have a way of lingering. Against every statistic, against every prayer my parents never said, I survived. Recovery wasn't a miracle. It was a slow, painful crawl out of a grave. And once I could stand on my own 2 feet again, I realized I had a very specific type of unfinished business. 2 years later, I found them. They had rebuilt their perfect life in a different city, pretending their only daughter was a tragic memory they didn't like to discuss. They were hosting a gala for a local charity, ironically one for children's health. I walked into that ballroom wearing a dress the color of a bruise. When my mother saw me, the champagne glass in her hand didn't just shake, it shattered. She cornered me in the hallway, her face pale, whispering, "Lily, how? Why are you here? We were told it was terminal. We did what we had to do for the family." She started rambling, trying to justify the abandonment, her eyes searching mine for forgiveness or anger. But I didn't give her either. I leaned in close, smelling the expensive perfume that cost more than one of my chemo rounds, and I gave her my 4-word response. The silence in that ballroom was heavy, but it was nothing compared to the silence of the last 2 years. My mother's breath hitched, her perfectly manicured hand trembling against her throat. She was waiting for a scream, a scene, a daughter falling apart. Instead, she got a version of me she didn't recognize. But before I tell you exactly what happened in that hallway, we have to go back to the basement of the hospital, the place where the old Lily Rose actually died. When my parents vanished, they didn't just take their emotional support. They cleared out my bank accounts. They were co-signers on everything. I was left with a hospital gown and a mountain of debt that looked like Everest. I remember sitting by the window, watching the rain hit the glass, wondering how people who tucked me in for 20 years could sleep at night, knowing I was coughing up blood in a ward they refused to visit. But they made one mistake. They forgot about my grandmother, Rose. She was a sharp, terrifyingly brilliant woman who never trusted my father. She had passed away 6 months before my diagnosis, leaving everything to the family. My father thought he had inherited her estate, but Rose had played a longer game. Tucked away in a safety deposit box, one that required a biometric scan only I possessed, was a secondary deed. I found out through a legal clerk who tracked me down in the oncology ward. My grandmother hadn't left my father the money, she had left him the management of it, while the ownership skipped a generation directly to me upon my 25th birthday. The realization was like a shot of adrenaline. While my mother was out buying new curtains for a house she bought with blood money, I was quietly signing papers from a hospital bed. I didn't just have enough for my treatment, I had enough to buy the very company my father worked for. I spent my recovery learning the language of shadows. I hired a private investigator to track their new life. I watched through digital lenses as they told their new friends that their daughter had passed away peacefully after a brave battle. They used my death to garner sympathy, to win social points, and to climb the ladder of the local elite. I wasn't a daughter to them anymore. I was a prop. Every night while the nurses changed my IV, I would look at the photos of them at garden parties. My father looked tan. My mother looked rested. They looked relieved. That was the spark that kept me alive when the chemo tried to kill me. I wasn't fighting for health. I was fighting for the moment I could stand in front of them and watch the color drain from their faces. I spent a year rebuilding my body and another year dismantling their facade from the shadows. I bought their debts. I influenced their social circles. I became the anonymous donor that funded the very gala they were standing in. Back in the hallway of the gala, my mother finally found her voice. "Lily, we can explain. We were in a dark place. We thought losing you would destroy us, so we had to move on to survive. You have to understand, it was for the best." She actually reached out to touch my arm, her eyes filling with performative tears, the kind she used for her charity speeches. I stepped back, the fabric of my dress shimmering like oil on water. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I realized I didn't feel any hate. I felt nothing, and that was the most dangerous thing of all. I leaned in, my voice a cold, steady ribbon of sound, and I whispered the 4 words that made her world start to crumble. But the words were just the beginning. The real trap was already closing around my father in the other room. The air in that hallway felt thin, like we were standing on the peak of a mountain where oxygen couldn't reach. My mother's face was a mask of expensive foundation and cheap excuses. She was looking for a daughter she could manipulate, a girl who would fall into her arms and weep for the lost years. But that girl was buried in the cemetery of the hospital's west wing. I leaned in, my lips inches from her ear. I could smell the gin on her breath and the panic radiating off her skin. I said it slowly, letting each syllable cut through the noise of the party. "I bought your house." She froze. The performative tears stopped instantly, replaced by a confused, jagged fear. "What? Lily, what are you talking about? That's impossible. Your father handled the—" "My father handled a loan he couldn't afford," I interrupted, my voice devoid of any warmth. "He used your new life as collateral for a lifestyle he didn't earn. And when the bank looked for a buyer for that debt, I was the only one standing there with a check." I pulled back to look at her. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The luxury, the social standing, the fresh start they had built on the lie of my death. It didn't belong to them anymore. It belonged to the ghost they had abandoned. While she stood there paralyzed, I turned my attention to the main ballroom. My father was at the center of a circle of local businessmen, laughing and holding a glass of scotch. He was playing the part of the grieving, successful father perfectly. He was mid-sentence, likely telling a story about his late daughter's bravery, when he caught sight of me. He didn't drop his glass. He was too disciplined for that. But his face turned a shade of gray I had only ever seen in the terminal ward. I didn't wait for him to approach me. I walked right into the center of his circle. The men around him fell silent, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. They looked at me, the woman in the bruise-colored dress, and then at him. "John," I said, using his first name for the first time in my life. "You look surprised. Didn't you get the invitation? I'm the one paying for the champagne tonight." He tried to laugh it off, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an exit. "Everyone, this is a misunderstanding. This woman is—" Your daughter? I prompted, my smile sharp enough to draw blood. The one you left in a cold room when the bills got too high? The one you told these people had died? The silence that followed was absolute. The elite of the city, the people he had spent 2 years trying to impress, were all watching. I could see the social ladder he had climbed so carefully beginning to splinter under his feet. Lily, let's go somewhere private, my father hissed, stepping toward me, his hand reaching for my elbow to steer me away. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I just looked down at his hand until he pulled it back. There is nothing private left between us, John, I said loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. You traded my life for a stable bank account. Now, I've decided to trade your reputation for a bit of closure. I reached into my small clutch and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. It wasn't a legal document. It was a copy of the letter they had left on my hospital bedside table, the one where they officially distanced themselves from my burden. I didn't give it to him. I gave it to the man standing next to him, the CEO of the largest firm in the city and my father's biggest client. Read the second paragraph, I suggested. It really captures his family values. As the CEO's eyes scanned the page, my father's world began to dissolve in real time. But I wasn't done. The house and the social standing were just the beginning. I wanted them to feel the same cold, empty isolation I felt when the nurses told me my parents weren't coming back. The CEO's face shifted from curiosity to a deep, visceral disgust as he read the words my father had written 2 years ago. He didn't say a word. He simply handed the paper to the woman next to him and walked away, leaving my father standing in an expanding circle of emptiness. The gala continued around us, but for my parents, the music had stopped. Lily, please, my mother whimpered, appearing at my father's side. She looked smaller now, the expensive jewelry around her neck looking more like a leash than an ornament. We were scared. You don't know what it's like to lose everything. I do, I replied, my voice as flat as a heart monitor's final beep. I know exactly what it's like. I lost my health, my home, and my parents in the span of 48 hours. The difference is, I grew a spine while you were busy growing a lie. I watched as my father's professional associates began to drift toward the exits. In this circle, scandal is a contagious disease, and I had just made my father patient zero, but the social execution was only the surface. I leaned in closer to both of them. Did you think I wouldn't look into the life insurance policy, Dad? His eyes widened. That was the final betrayal, the one I had uncovered during my months of recovery. When they abandoned me, they hadn't just walked away from the bills. They had kept the high-value life insurance policy active. They weren't just waiting for me to die. They were financially incentivized for it to happen. They had been checking my medical updates not out of hope, but out of a desire for a payout. That policy is being investigated for fraud, I lied, though I knew the threat alone would be enough to keep him awake for a decade. I've spent the last 6 months making sure every penny you thought you'd gain from my death is tied up in a legal knot you'll never untie. My father's bravado finally snapped. You're a monster, he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and defeat. No, I said, tilting my head. I'm your daughter. I'm exactly what you raised me to be. Efficient, calculated, and focused on the bottom line. You should be proud. Your investment finally paid off. I turned my back on them then. I walked through the ballroom, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. I felt the weight of their stares, the whispers following me like a wake, but for the first time in years, I felt light. As I stepped out into the cool night air, leaving the glitter and the lies behind, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from my legal team. The final stage of the takeover was complete. By tomorrow morning, the house they lived in, the cars they drove, and the very ground they stood on would belong to a holding company they couldn't access. They would have to move. They would have to find jobs. They would have to live the burdened life they were so afraid of. But as I sat in the back of my car, watching the gala lights fade in the rearview mirror, a realization hit me. Revenge is a cold meal, but it doesn't actually fill your stomach. I had dismantled their world, but I still had to build my own. And there was one person I still hadn't confronted, the doctor who had whispered to me that my parents had stopped paying the bills. The drive away from the gala was the quietest moment of my life. For years, I had fueled my recovery with the heat of this confrontation. I thought that seeing them broken would feel like a cure. But as the city lights blurred past, I realized that revenge is just another way of staying connected to the people who hurt you. By the next morning, the fallout was scorched earth. My father's firm issued a statement, parting ways with him before the sun was fully up. The social clubs revoked my mother's membership via email. They were suddenly toxic, a reminder of a cruelty that even the elite couldn't stomach. They tried to call me, of course. My mother sent a dozen messages, shifting from apologies to begging for money, then finally to accusations. I didn't block her. I just let the notifications pile up like autumn leaves, pretty to look at, but dead nonetheless. I went back to the hospital one last time, not as a patient, but as the owner of a new foundation. I sat in the same plastic chair where my father had sat when he decided I was too expensive to keep. I met with the head of oncology and handed over the deed to the property I had seized from my parents. Turn it into a recovery house, I told him, for patients whose families couldn't handle the burden. He looked at the paperwork, then at me. And what should we call it? Rose House, I said, after the woman who actually knew how to protect her own. As for my parents, they ended up in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. They work ordinary jobs now, the kind of invisible work they used to look down on. They are still together, but only because they have no one else to blame but each other. They live in the silence they once tried to impose on me. I realized that my 4-word response, "I bought your house," wasn't just about real estate. It was about ownership. I bought back my life. I bought back my future. And in doing so, I made them irrelevant. The bruises on my skin are gone, replaced by a strength that doesn't show up on an X-ray. I am a survivor, a strategist, and finally, I am free. The story doesn't end with a happily ever after. It ends with a starting over. And this time, I'm the one holding the pen. End question. If you were in Lily's shoes, would you have shared your wealth with your parents, or was her silence the ultimate justice? Thanks for listening to this journey on Lily Calm's Stories. If this narrative moved you, hit the like button and subscribe for more deep human stories.